She's also regularly interviewed on nationally and internationally syndicated networks like RT, the BBC, and radio stations across the nation about the need for independent journalism, effects of neoconservatism in the media, as well as dissecting war narratives. She started her career as an independent multimedia journalist covering Midwest and national politics while focusing on civil liberties and social justice issues, posting her reporting and exclusive interviews on her blog, MintPress, which she later turned MintPress into a global news source it is today. In 2009, Muhawesh also became the first American woman to wear the hijab to anchor report the news in American media. Muhawesh is also a wife and mother of a 6-year-old boy, juggling her duties as a CEO, editor, and motherly tasks successfully as supermom.
Thank you.
If we could give a warm welcome to Mnar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And do you mind if we move this here so I can have some space? Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much. This is my first time giving a presentation to local government, so I'm feeling the pressure right now. But one second, let me just get my mic on. I'll put it over here. Does the mic sound okay? All right. I think I have to hold this one for you guys. There you go. Does that work? Yes. Okay, there we go. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here and really humbled to be among a lot of local game changers who work tirelessly every single day to improve our communities on a grassroots level. I'm even more honored that Margaret invited me to speak, who has been such an enormous supporter and advocate for myself and for the work that I do. And as cliche as it might sound, it always warms my heart when I look around at my circle of friends and advocates, and I see that my biggest supporters are Christian pastor and Jewish anti-war activists. It puts a really big smile on my face because in a world that is so divided, it's friends and circles like these that give me hope for a peaceful future. And it's no wonder, because our media works tirelessly as well every single day to divide us and make us fear what is different. And I'm really excited to hopefully shed some light on re-empowering our local communities through watchdog journalism and grassroots efforts, and talk about an interesting concept that I actually spoke about at another event that Margaret was present at, which is the concept of glocal and how it's essential to reviving media narratives and especially in understanding war narratives. Glocal simply means to think globally and act locally. In a world that seems so vast and large, sometimes even confusing and extremely frightening and dangerous, we are all very interconnected, more interconnected than we might like to think. And our everyday decisions do impact people around us and around people around the world as well. Yet, it begs a question, why do so many of us live in fear of what we do not know and what is different than us? With wars specifically raging on in Africa and the Middle East against rising terrorism, and war here at home for justice against government corruption, income inequality, and the growing police brutality, that silly concept of peace seems nearly impossible. How we hear and learn about the world and even what's going on around us in our own backyards is through one lens, which is the media. But never has this lens been more narrow and more extreme than it is today. In the words of Amy Goodman, we do not have a mainstream media anymore. We have an extreme media beating the drums of war. Between the overhyping of Donald Trump's ridiculous rants and racist raves, media whitewashing of white supremacist crimes, while villainizing young, unarmed African-American teens murdered by some police officers, the unlimited coverage of terror attacks in Western nations like France, while daily terror that strikes Gaza, Somalia, Mali, the Congo, and Liberia go completely without a mention in the media. And how can we forget about the personal attacks, of course, between two-party candidates like Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush? The media are actually training us to fit the mold of a shallow society that thrives off of fear, sensationalism, and one that encourages us to hate and support war, whether it's a class war here at home or one that is abroad. And when it comes specifically to the Middle East, we have the coverage of ISIS, beheadings of journalists, Iran's nuclear ambitions, the Syrian civil war, the Sunni-Shiite divide, and of course Palestinian resistance. It seems almost instantly those naive and evil preconceptions about the Middle East post 9/11 have resurfaced all over again. Muslims are the boogeyman of our time. In fact, Islamophobia is such a hot button topic. It's an industry worth $200 billion per year. And the resurgence of this Cold War rhetoric between the United States, Russia, and its NATO allies, first over Russia's strategic alliance with Syria's Bashar al-Assad, and then the tug of war over Ukraine, and now Turkey's downing of a Russian fighter jet that was targeting ISIS in Syria. It's as if we're careening toward World War III, and the media is cheerleading us on. And in our own backyards, there is a movement that is growing that we rarely hear about, that is demanding justice against police misconduct and brutality, against a 1% elite that have amounted the wealth of over 50% of the world's population. While gunmen are shooting up schools, Planned Parenthood facilities, and just yesterday with the very tragic shooting against our most vulnerable, the disabled, in San Bernardino, California. I always wonder why some stories get unlimited 24-hour news coverage every single day, while other real important stories can go without a mention. I talk to a lot of people about these stories, and I give a lot of presentations about media coverage and narratives and what's being covered in the media and what's not. And I always get the same response, which is people tell me, I don't even like turning on the TV anymore or care to follow the news. It's too depressing. I can't do anything about it, so people feel very helpless. And in our fast food headline-driven industry, we experience information overload to the point where even when we're getting the stories, we know that we're not getting the full picture of what's going on. How many of you can relate to that? That's what I thought. It's no wonder, because you're not alone. A recent Gallup poll actually showed that over 60% of Americans don't trust the corporate media anymore. The same people that I just mentioned who are frustrated with the media, who don't trust it, they are the same people who are actually concerned about really important issues like war and its human casualty, the growing income inequality in this nation, climate change, the state and the future of our planet, net neutrality, big money in politics, police brutality, Big Brother spying on us, the fading away of our civil liberties. In fact, these are not the concerns of a fringe minority anymore, nor are they the concerns of a silent majority. In fact, these are the concerns of the silenced majority, as I like to say it. And we are silenced by this extremist corporate media, driven by a headline news industry like the BuzzFeeds that rule over us and give us fast food style news snippets that doesn't really have any substance. That's why it's more important now than ever that we take our media back through independent and grassroots efforts like MintPress and others that I see growing. Because without an independent media acting as a watchdog to those in power, we are only feeding into a system that drives revenue to elitists through the most profitable act of business our nation has come too comfortably to love, which is war, whether again it's at home or abroad. And this is obviously only possible through hate. Hate is a lucrative business, and hate sells. And if our leaders here or anywhere in the world can get us to fear each other, to hate each other, to fight each other, to divide us and distract us, the real issues at hand that I just mentioned that we're actually caring about, that mean a lot to us, then conquering and exploiting us here or abroad wouldn't be that difficult. As of 2001, 6 corporations own the media. Those are General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS, and that trickles all the way down to our local channels and newspapers. And if you heard that right, that means that the defense, arms, cable, and entertainment industries like the powers that be in Hollywood control over 90% of what 300 million Americans see, hear, and read every single day. So statistically speaking, for every 50 million Americans, one corporation provides their news. And through the process of media consolidation and corporate ownership of our media, the entities the press is meant to hold accountable became the owners of that media. And this actually took place mostly in between the 1980s and the 1990s, when neoliberal economic policies were encouraged, and the very corporations that the media was meant to hold accountable ended up taking ownership of the media because of lobbying the FCC. And if you noticed, I pointed out that it was in 2001 that the media was wrapping up its consolidation. And in 2001, it was when our country launched its official war on terror, or after 9/11. And during this time, a new climate erupted in our press. This general climate of fear and anger towards a very specific group of people, and that was American Muslims and Muslims abroad. A caricature of the civilization of jihad, I'm sure many of you have heard that term, narrative, and biased media coverage of wars overseas were hijacking most of the coverage, and they kind of still are today. This climate of fear has manifested itself in the last 14 years in institutional policies that view American Muslims as a threat, and they are treated as suspect when doing just about anything. Despite most of the 9/11 hijackers being from Saudi Arabia, President Bush went on to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, two nations strategically located in a resource-rich region, still untouched by multinational corporations, and regions which would later act as a military base buffer zones to China and Russia's growing influence. Now, despite our long history of funding and arming both the brutal dictatorship of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the Mujahideen movement in Afghanistan, NATO entered a new era of endless war, grabbing of resources, fomenting civil strife like we're seeing today in Syria, supporting more right-wing militias, and spreading monopoly capitalism. Take the war for Iraq an example. I used this example in a presentation I gave on Islamophobia just a few months ago. The Iraq War is a lot of things to a lot of people, and if we look at Hollywood movies like American Sniper, I'm sure many of you have heard of that movie, the Iraq War was a patriotic mission defending American freedoms and values abroad. Even though the movie was released 12 years after 9/11, the producers attempted to insult our intelligence by rewriting the US destruction of that country by tying 9/11 to Saddam Hussein to justify that war. And as you know, they were not tied. Chris Kyle, the Navy SEAL, who the Hollywood blockbuster was based on, wrote a book by the same name that encapsulates his hatred, bigotry, and enthusiasm for what he called killing Iraqi savages. What he wrote in his book is a microcosm of the way the American press today, and still does, portray Arabs and Muslims alike to foment that fear and justify these military operations abroad. He wrote, "Savage, despicable evil. That's what we were fighting in Iraq. That's why a lot of people, myself included, called the enemy savages. There was really no other way to describe what we had encountered there." Now, this caricature that has been painted by the media that Muslims are savages is also responsible for the rise of hate crimes that have targeted American Muslims. Just this summer, I found my family and myself at the center of a major hate crime that made local news here at KARE 11, and the story went totally viral and made national news as well. My own parents were held at gunpoint because a white middle-aged suburban mom from Brooklyn Park thought that they looked suspicious. My parents are both Palestinian American. My mother wears the hijab like I do. My father has a darker complexion. They're both in their late 50s, early 60s. They were waiting to pick up my 16-year-old brother from a friend's house, right in front of the house in Brooklyn Park. And this woman approached my parents with a rifle directed at them with no warning and threatened to shoot them because she thought that they looked suspicious. My parents put their hands up immediately and told her that they were there to pick up my little brother. The woman didn't believe a word that they said. She went to my father's side and ordered him to get out of the car with that rifle pointing right in his face. She put the rifle against the back of his head, lowered it to his back. She then ordered my dad to prove to her that they were there to pick up my brother. And she marched him with the rifle on his back up to the house so that he can prove to her that my brother was indeed in there. And she consistently kept saying, "I don't believe you or your kind. You are very suspicious to be in this neighborhood." Of course, when my brother came out, she put the rifle behind her back and apologized. My parents thought that they were going to be killed that night. My parents later pressed charges against this woman, and she's now facing a court hearing actually this month, but the police said that they would not look into this as a hate crime. But it had hate crime written all over it. Of course, the scars this terrifying incident has left on my family will stay with us forever. Now, my parents are certainly not alone. It's estimated that about 500 hate crimes occur against Muslims in the United States per year, and that is since 9/11 specifically. And studies have shown time and time again that the perpetrators are following very right-wing news like Fox News that teaches hate. It always goes back to that hate. And in the past year, right-wing groups have armed themselves. This happened just last month, and in this summer, it was all over the news in Arizona. They armed themselves with loaded guns, holding pig heads, bullet-riddled Qurans, and American flags as they marched to mosques to tell American Muslims that they were not welcome here, that they had to go back to where they came from. Of course, most of these people are from the United States. And now I'm going to go back to the Iraq War really quick. Now, despite the nearly 2 million civilian casualties in the Iraq War and nearly 2 million from the US war in Afghanistan that we rarely ever hear about, for big business, however, the war in Iraq was a lucrative cash cow for over 25 multinational oil, construction, agriculture, equity, and banking corporations. Take, for example, Dick Cheney's former company Halliburton, which gained $17.2 billion in Iraq war-related revenue from 2003 and 2006. But the often very sensitive part of the story that I just mentioned is the human cost. Since 1990, it's been estimated that up to 8 million Muslims have died due to direct and indirect military operations in just Iraq and Afghanistan at the hands of US and NATO wars in those countries. Now, I'd like everybody to just pause for a second and think about that number. 8 million people. How often have we heard that number in the media? We don't. It doesn't exist. And we're not talking about terror groups. We're not talking about extremists or anything like that. We're talking about regular, innocent people who died because of those actions. And this report was actually released a few months ago by the Nobel Peace Prize winning doctors based in DC, Physicians for Social Responsibility. And surprisingly, CNN released statistics just this month that showed that since 2001, about 3,000 Americans died due to terrorism. Americans are more likely to be killed by right-wing hate groups with guns than a terrorist. So how do politicians continue to justify the murder of 8 million people in the Middle East and convince the masses that these wars are being fought for human rights? That is the golden question. This is the most important question that we ask tonight because it can help us really understand how this climate of fear is crafted and how war in general is sold to the public. It's very simple. It's dehumanization of the victims of war. It's happened throughout all of history, and this is not a new concept. I've sat down with former Pentagon officials like Wayne Quist, he's also a counterterrorism expert, and CIA officials like John Kiriakou, who exposed the waterboarding and torture program in the last few years. And John Kiriakou specifically said to me, "There's no such thing as American exceptionalism anymore. While the US claims to be defending human rights around the world, it's really just securing its oil interests. We love to say that we're this shining city on the hill where we support human rights, but the truth of the matter is We only support those human rights when the country has oil it can sell us. That's just a fact of American policy in the Middle East. Now, John Kiriakou, I don't know if many of you know him, but he spent, I believe it was over 20 years in Kuwait and in Bahrain, working in those countries, and it worked with, obviously, the US government to build its presence in those countries. Jumping to the current war we are involved in now, that the media has fear-mongered the public into supporting, is the one against the terror group ISIS. But it has turned into a gravy train for profits. From a report that we conducted at MintPress, since the beginning of the year, the defense stocks of America's top 5 arms producers, like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, they're trading at record prices as shareholders reap the benefits from escalating military conflicts around the world, including that against ISIS, fueling the very military-industrial complex that has ownership of our media that I mentioned before and drives the public to support those wars. Now, it's important to break this specific conflict down because it would help us understand not only how the media manipulates conflict narratives to justify war, but it could help us better understand how we need to reform our foreign policy to suit a peace economy. The war in ISIS really seems complex, hard to follow, sectarian, you name it, savages. They've been killing each other for thousands of years. We hear it all the time. But the fact is that US intelligence has assessed that ISIS actually poses no current threat to the US, and that is completely and often ignored by our politicians and media. In the last 2 years, President Obama and others have presented the American public with the idea that ISIS could pose a threat to the US. So they're saying the opposite, which is why our no boots on the ground initiative against ISIS started over a year ago in Iraq, and now it's expanded into Syria, which is completely contradicting evidence provided by US intelligence. In fact, what the media has done is provided unlimited airtime to these politicians, to these analysts who work for these military contractors without questioning them once. But the narrative is always Orientalist and it's dehumanizing. We're told that the conflicts in the Middle East are sectarian. The people can't get along. They've been fighting for over 1,400 years. This is what we've been told every single day. But none of that is true. The story is as simple as this. What we're seeing taking place in the Middle East is indeed a mess fueled by sectarianism, but it's a mess that we allowed to happen. It's a mess that is also being fomented by competing regional allies in the Middle East like Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Not only for economic and regional influence, but most importantly for control over the world's largest oil reserves that exist in the Middle East, and gas supplies as well. Because at the end of the day, money means power. It's as simple as that. Everything goes back to basic economics. Now, the story really begins in invading Iraq and the near invasion of Syria about 2 years ago. According to retired NATO Security General Wesley Clark, in a video that has gone totally viral, a memo from the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense just a few weeks after 9/11 revealed plans to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and moving on to Syria, to Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and then Iran. Does any of that sound familiar? In a subsequent interview, Clark argues that this strategy is fundamentally about control of the region's vast oil and gas resources. Now, thanks to alternative media like WikiLeaks, leaked emails from the private intelligence firm Stratford, including notes from meetings with Pentagon officials as well, have confirmed that the United States and the UK were actively training Syrian opposition forces since 2011. That's an entire year before the Syrian revolt took place, aimed at the collapse of the Assad government from within. This was the same strategy that we would use, we would engage in Libya with the fall of Gaddafi. And I just want to remind everyone that this is not a defense of those leaderships, just the same thing as Iraq, but it's important to understand how these policies work in fomenting this regime change. These leaked documents I was just referring to say the geographic area of proven oil reserves coincides with the power base of much of the jihadist Salafist network. This creates a linkage between oil supplies and the war that I was mentioning that is not easily broken down or characterized. For the foreseeable future, world oil production growth and total output will be dominated by Persian Gulf resources, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And how this will be accomplished will be through sectarianism and civil strife. It's divide and conquer. Divide and rule focuses on exploiting fault lines, the documents say, between the various Salafi jihadist groups in turn to turn them against each other and dissipate their energy. Nationalist jihadists to launch proxy campaigns, just like we're seeing in Syria today and in Somalia and other nations. U.S. leaders could also choose to capitalize on the sustained Shia-Sunni divide trajectory by taking the side of the conservative Sunni regimes against Shiite empowerment movements in the Muslim world. So it created, because of this new policy that was drafted in 2001, it created a policy that divided U.S. influence and support for allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, and Turkey versus countries like Syria and Iran. And how this would be executed, the report goes on to say, would be shoring up the traditional Sunni regimes in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Pakistan as a way of containing Iranian power and influence in the region. Noting that this would actually empower the Al-Qaeda jihadists like ISIS and the former smaller Al-Qaeda group, the report concluded that doing so might work in Western interests by bogging down jihadi activity with internal sectarian rivalry rather than targeting the US. All of this supports the military-industrial complex that supports that endless war that I just mentioned. And as a result, this same terror group, ISIS, that we are airstriking in Syria and Iraq has taken control of oil and gas reserves in Syria and Iraq. They are now the richest and most well-financed terror group in the world, thanks to their selling of their resources on the black market. And those that are buying their oil are none other than Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Israel, the United States, and NATO allies. But the media will never tell us that it's about economics. Who would support a war for oil, gas, and for money? That's not ethical or respectable. It's completely immoral. Not many people would jump on board, though, when we're saying that we're fighting a necessary evil. We've all heard those terms before in the media. We're fighting people that hate us for our freedom, and we're saving the innocent people that live there. So that is a summary of what's going on in the Middle East and how the media has completely manipulated the narrative of what's going on there. And it's a lot to take in. A lot of times when I give those presentations, people kind of just have their jaw dropped and they look at me like, what? Where did this all come from? But this is what I specialize in. I speak a lot about dissecting war narratives because they really are confusing. And the reason I do this is because, you know, I have a 6-year-old son, as Doug mentioned, and I worry about his future. I worry about the growing rise of these terror groups just as much as anybody else, and the rise also of the hate that is rising among a lot of these right-wing groups that are targeting Muslims, so who don't even realize that what they're doing is just as bad as these other, you know, terror groups, like the man that we saw that shot up the Planned Parenthood, who went and went to kill people because they were killing people. That's the logic that he was using. Or the man who just shot up the disabled in California. These are all criminal acts. And what we're all experiencing now is a lot of fear. And this is not a coincidence. This is on purpose. And it's so, again, it's a divide and conquer strategy here against us, to divide us so that we can hate each other, so that we can misunderstand each other, so that people at the very top can continue doing what they're doing abroad and overseas. Now, having said all of this, I've spent the last 15 years, since I was 13 years old, speaking about this very subject, the driving factors of war. And I've been dissecting war narratives for my entire adult life. I actually don't just specialize in the Middle East, but that's something that is the hot button topic right now. Talk about South America and African affairs as well. But whether it's through exposing the puppeteers behind the media manipulation, neoconservative attacks on peace movements, or war profiteering, those are the kinds of issues that I typically talk about. But it's because of everything that I've shared with you today about war, the targeting of Muslims, media manipulation, and this overall climate of fear that we've fallen victim to. These issues, every single one of them, has affected my life personally as a Muslim American journalist and citizen of this country. I'm certainly not alone, but it's important to hear why from a personal perspective, because my story is one of trials and tribulations, identity crisis, because of my family as immigrants, and standing firm and tall against the wind. From my early childhood, I learned the hard way that wars were never really meant to defend human rights. We don't just bomb people to save people. That just doesn't make any sense. Growing up in the United States, I actually didn't know much about my parents' culture or heritage or religion because I grew up here in the United States. I'm from Maple Grove, and my parents growing up were actually very secular. We didn't really grow up in a traditional Muslim family. But one day, my parents decided it was time to move us all back, the entire family, to Jerusalem, where they were from, to be closer to family and to learn more about our Palestinian heritage, because we're an indigenous people. As I was very young. I was 9 years old, and I didn't speak a word of Arabic, and had no idea how this move would eventually change my life forever and impact the decisions that I would make as an adult, like the ones that I make today. We moved to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, in 1997. We assimilated. I got to meet my parents' family, make new friends, visit historic and tourist holy sites, Christian churches, Muslim mosques, Jewish temples. The people and geography were certainly a sight to remember. The skies were always blue, the sun was always shining, the pigeons were everywhere, and everyone you meet has a big smile on their face, greeting you, and invites you into their home for a beautiful meal with some tea. But all these details aside, it was really hard not to notice that even at 9 years old, that I had just moved into apartheid and a semi-war zone under colonial occupation. The first year we lived in Jerusalem, the things there politically were very calm. But soon into the second and third years, the Palestinian uprising, or intifada, had erupted against Israeli apartheid and military occupation. And by this time, I was about 12 years old, and I had already witnessed human rights abuses by a state that had convinced me it was a civilized democracy. I witnessed Palestinians being subjugated to discriminatory laws, having their travel controlled, living behind a 30-foot-high concrete apartheid wall, separating them from the rest of the world. Every single day was a matter of survival while living under martial law and military occupation. I was surrounded with thoughts of children being killed by bombs, families left homeless from airstrikes, electricity and water cutoffs, entire cities having their water poisoned by settlers. Men and young boys were abducted by police in the middle of the night for raids and held in indefinite detention by Israeli soldiers. I would cross through checkpoints where the taxi driver would yell, "Duck," because Israeli soldiers would be shooting rubber bullets and live ammunition at children who were throwing rocks at them because they were being blocked and denied an education from going to school. I would go to school in the 6th grade and the 7th grade with nearly half the seats empty in my classroom because the rest of those kids were being blocked from crossing those armed checkpoints. Soldiers were pointing guns at citizens, were roaming the streets. Israeli settlers would kidnap children and plant bombs at Palestinian elementary schools. It was a common occurrence. This happened to my own aunt, who's a principal at an all-girls elementary school. They had to evacuate several times. I was traumatized, to say the least. Now, I didn't come here to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because I know how heated it is, and it's a very misunderstood conflict, to say the least. But I wanted to use the media coverage of Palestine as an example of just how irresponsible the media has been covering the subject accurately. What the media has done for the conflict, however, is break it down in language that is far too familiar for all of us. It's a religious fight. Muslim versus Jew. It's all religions. They've been fighting each other for centuries. They describe it as Palestinians are Muslim militants who want to kill all Jews and annihilate the state of Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East. That's what we hear every single day, using the pretext of the Holocaust to increase sentiment. Well, now, when I described the experience religion living under apartheid, it was just that. It was apartheid. I painted a picture of my personal experience living through a human rights crisis as a child. I described the reality on the ground of fascism, a police state, inequality, colonialism, and most obviously apartheid and war. But this conflict, and most conflicts, are never presented to us that way, especially if it's an ally of our nation and major arms buyer. Little did I know moving overseas that this experience would shape not only my perspective on life, but how the media operates. When we finally moved back to the United States because we couldn't handle living in the war any longer in 2001, just a few months before 9/11, I was absolutely traumatized. I suffered from what military service members suffer when they return from Iraq, which is survivor's guilt. I had PTSD and severe anxiety, which I still go to counseling and therapy for. I was now living a comfortable life back in Maple Grove, Minnesota, but I could not forget what I had left behind and the suffering I knew people there were still enduring. If anyone uttered the word Palestine or Jerusalem at that point, I would literally burst out in tears. My teachers would ask me, "Where are you from? Where'd you come from?" And I would say, "Palestine," and I would just start bawling. I was now 13 years old, excuse me. It's almost happening to me again. I was now 13 years old and felt like no one had understood what I had witnessed, excuse me. And this is Maple Grove we're talking about. While most teenagers at this age are worried about football games, shopping, and partying, I turned to the media to stay up to date with the war that I could not let go of. But what I got, again, were images of Palestinian men covering their faces, bearing guns, and reporters referring to Palestinians as Hamas or militants, never just the regular people that I saw or myself. Wow, this is like the longest I've ever cried in a speech. The media instilled fear into the hearts and minds of Americans to help justify Israel's apartheid and fascist policies on a defenseless population. Why wouldn't they? Israel buys over $3 billion of military aid from the United States each year. Once again, it just comes down to basic economics. And the media did what the media does best in covering events in the Middle East. It said it was a religious war. And of course, just a few months later, the tragic day of 9/11 took place. And immediately, the war drums were beating. Although I was young, I was 12 years old at this point, I was mature enough to understand that the media was creating a new climate of fear, as I mentioned earlier. Anger towards Muslims and American Muslims was fomented, as seen in the civilization of jihad narrative, that the region was filled with savages. The media convinced us that the people in the Middle East hated us for our freedoms. They are backwards, savages, and just evil. The media encouraged and even justified our country turning into a surveillance state by passing the Patriot Act and enabling NSA spying, and villainized over a quarter of the world's population who are Muslim because of the horrific acts of a few that were being armed and trained by our allies in the region. Although I was only 13, it was obvious to me that solutions to this human rights crisis could never be solved with more bombs, more weapons flowing into the region, more killing, and certainly not a media that was acting as the military's mouthpiece. Within a few weeks after 9/11, peers who I thought were my friends abandoned me and said that my people had committed 9/11. The administrative office at my school called me down one day, searched my entire locker, and undressed me and searched me as well. And I was 13 at the time. They gave me no reasoning. They just said that they were concerned about me. Of course, this was before Twitter and Facebook. If that would have happened now, it would have been a different story. But it took one day, one experience, one tragedy, and I, like many Muslim Americans across the nation, were officially an other. And as a Palestinian, I was told I didn't have a home in Palestine due to Israel's ethnic cleansing. And as an American, being Muslim meant I had to try really hard to prove that I loved my country and supported its war. Through these experiences, having lived through apartheid, having lived through a war, and having witnessed our media act as interest groups, I pointed to the media as the source of lack of solutions we have available to bring about real peace, unity, and justice in the world. I blame the media for my fellow Americans' lack of understanding about these issues and empathy for the human casualty on the ground. My story of what I witnessed and what I lived through is only one of 1,000 under occupation. I have sat and watched events unfold in Palestine, in Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Iraq, Congo, and elsewhere, and wonder how the media continues to be complicit in these crimes in Gaza, and Libya and Syria, and without a mention of these arms flowing to these dictators in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and right-wing militias. But with everything that has happened, I found courage and catharsis in pursuing journalism to speak out, not just for Palestinians, but for all people around the world who are suffering and who are being massacred in the name of power, money, and greed, whether it be in Sudan, the Congo, Burma, Syria, Iraq, Central African Republic, China, Mexico, you name it. And in 2009, against all odds, I became the first American woman to wear the hijab to anchor or report the news in the United States. Ironically, I started my journalism career in St. Cloud, which is a Michelle Bachmann district. And most people I had met, and this was actually immediately after I decided to wear the hijab, because after 9/11, I went on my own personal journey to find out the truth about Islam. That there's no way that 1.6 billion people follow a religion of violence and hate. I need to study the religion. And once I read more into it and realized these terror groups were following a politicized movement that worked in the interest of oil companies, I realized that that wasn't the religion that I was following. I'm going to follow the real Islam, which is a religion about modesty and being humble and kind and peaceful, the one that we never hear about. I started to wear the hijab, and I began my journalism career in St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is, again, a Michelle Bachmann district. And people I would meet there would tell me that they had never met a Muslim before, but they'd always appreciate that I'm just American. I always thought that was kind of funny. Soon after, I interned with NBC's KARE 11 here, locally, for about a year and worked with their reporting and online news programs. I helped them launch the 4 o'clock show, now hosted by Deanna Pierce, and built their online presence. But despite how much I learned from my work there at KARE 11, which is a corporate newsroom, let's be honest here, even local news doesn't get to the heart of the story. The weather section of the news gets more attention than the rest of the program. And it's mostly because of the business the business strategy of most of these corporate newsrooms. I still felt like my career in journalism wasn't being fulfilled when I worked at KARE 11. The whole reason I became a journalist was to challenge the establishment narrative, provide a voice to the voiceless, and expose the true costs of war. One of the leading top stories at the time when I worked at KARE 11 was the story of a young woman who had dropped her wedding ring in a lake and the Care 11 crew was out looking for the, doing a story on how the community had come together to find this ring in the lake. And while it was a very good story and it was well said and well presented to the audience, it just wasn't the kind of news that I wanted to provide. I then left the corporate media and launched my own personal blog called MintPress, where I freelanced and covered stories that I thought the media was ignoring. I had the opportunity to interview some big names and influential people like former Pentagon official Wayne Quist, who in several interviews explained to me the driving forces behind the war on terror. So it was a Pentagon official that actually encouraged me to research more on these issues. Journalism has become my outlet for the helplessness that I grew up feeling when I suffered from PTSD for several years, the anxiety that I live with every single day because of what I had endured, and for the trauma that I carry because of my life in a war zone, and knowing that so many people that I left behind are still struggling, whether it's in Palestine or Israel or anywhere else. Providing a voice to the voiceless, covering national and international stories through the lens of social justice and human rights is the whole reason I started MintPress. And I really hope that more of us can come together in the cause of human rights and know that every life is precious. Because at the end of the day, it's really not about religion or Islam or Muslims. This is a class war being waged by the 1% global elite, who now have owned over 50% of the world's entire wealth. We are simply humans struggling in a life for freedom in a world divided by nations. And if I could leave you with anything today, just remember that political language has unfortunately been designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. Malcolm X once said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people that are being oppressed and loving the people that are doing the oppressing. Thank you.